sort of an odd irony to this, me following Alec. I followed Alec at law school. He was 2 years ahead of me. Established the UIW clinic, which was a law student clinic helping workers who had been injured, that I subsequently went to. So in that sense, following Alec is sort of a tradition that I've had for some time. And in some ways, I'm going to talk about the same thing, but from a completely different perspective. Alec has given you sort of the description of what happened, as he said, at height. What I'm going to do is turn it upside down and start where Leo was, and what Leo was talking about, and how this came to be. And before I'm going to do it I'm going to give you sort of an overview. I'm going to even give you a longer historical overview, but it's only going to be a couple minutes. And then I want to add to what you already know from what Leo said about the origin of OCAL by asking Don Fraser to come up and talk about the establishment of the 1005 clinic and sort of the health and safety activism at 1005, because that's a particular context that's important to why it happened. And then I want to get into a little bit about where knowledge activism fits in, where it actually comes from, and then make a couple of comments about the future. So the broader context is this, right? We just heard talk about the 70s. I'm actually going to take you back even further, because what I think is really important to everybody in this room is that whatever it is that you specifically do, what we all share in common is we are part of a movement. We are part of the health and safety movement. And what's remarkable in this province is we can actually trace it and document it going back to the late 1800s, when unions and activists came together to protest the destruction and death that was being caused in the early industrial workplaces and in the rail and in mining in Canada. And that was sufficient to push the creation of the first health and safety laws, but also workers' comp. So it was sort of the beginning of the movement and a very important part of it. All of this is described actually as a series of phases by Eric Tucker in a number of pieces that he wrote. Eric, a professor at Osgoode at York University. And I put it in that context because we're always part of something bigger and longer. We play an important part, but if we don't see it in that context, we don't see how we progressed. We don't see our challenges in the proper context. And I say this because for another person who was written quite substantially in this area is a fellow by the name of Robert Story at McMaster, and he wrote some of the early articles looking at the health and safety movement, and declared, I think somewhat unfortunately, in one of his earlier articles, that the health and safety movement was dead. And I thought this was a particularly unusual thing to say, given what we've been talking about, what's going on around us. But I think it's a product of people who take too short-term a view of things and define the movement in only a limited way. Because really what it is an expansion driven by workers and the experience of workers, because this is about occupational health and safety, but with the support and direction of unions, but also making context another way. And what I think is particularly important about that phase of the movement that begins to come in the late 60s and 70s is that it not only transformed the workplaces, but it also transformed what we see as health and safety movement, the movement itself, and what workers' role was within it. We were no longer just the object or even the subject. We were a participant and an actor within it. And I can't think of a better place in my experience to sort of focus that in our context than to ask Don to come up and talk a little bit about what Leo alluded to, right? That OCAL was built on something that previously was existing at that time. That something had been created here by Local 1005 of the steelworkers. And though it has a history, if you follow the Western Mining Federation back in the earlier parts of the century, they created clinics in remote communities because there wasn't anything else there. These were clinics to provide the direct medical care to the workers and their families who were working in those areas. And what Don's going to talk about is a significant development from that. Don, do you want to come and give just a sort of an introduction as to what it was really like at that time and what 1005 was doing?
To put everything in context, I have to take you back to the 70s. No cell phones, no internet, no computers. They just invented something called a fax machine, and they just started coming out with pagers. So everything that we were involved in doing was all paperwork. The Occupational Health and Safety Act had just become law. The OFAVL had what was called the OFAVL Training Project at the time, that was taking health and safety activists out of the workplace for 3 weeks and training them on what the act was all about. And more importantly, because as Andy said, it gave us some rights to participate, how to apply it to the workplace. And the workplace I came out of was 13,500 people in the bargaining unit. Another 6,000 or 7,000 salary and contractors went into that plant every day. The company carried 600 people extra to the workforce. So if that somebody got hurt, they had a body to put in there to keep the production going. That was the mentality back then in a lot of companies, not only Stelco, but a lot of companies in Ontario. And when the act became law, the first thing the company did was offer us all full-time jobs, the people on the committee, and we turned them down. Because we knew to handle health and safety in that plant, 1,100 acres, 3 outside mills, more than 5 people had to be involved in it. And we established a structure that ultimately we had over 265 health and safety reps that were members of the Joint Committee, worker members on the Joint Committee to handle health and safety. We quickly realized that, quite frankly, we were outgunned by the company's medical department, the company's industrial hygiene department, because we didn't have the resources or the knowledge back then to take them on. We had a little revolution in the local union in the elections, and I called it, we Canadianized the union. Most of the people that got elected on the executive were born in Canada, not imports. They had done their role in the union. Now it was time to pass the torch along. And a number of us that were on the Health and Safety Committee were always on the executive. So we went to the executive and said, look, this is the problem. We're getting outgunned here. We haven't got the resources. We want to investigate an idea of setting up our own clinic. They established a couple of people that did the research on it, and it'll be 39 years ago in December that those people came back to the executive and then the membership with a recommendation for 1005 to establish an occupational health and safety clinic. After 45 minutes of debate, it passed the membership unanimously. So the first clinic opened in 1980. Storefront on Barton Street, just down from the Steelworkers Hall on Barton Street. And you know you've got a good idea when people try to hijack it for their own purposes. So there was a history of that occurring where the idea of the union movement and the purpose of the clinic for the workers to give us the resources, the committee people and that, versus people that want it for their own ideas or personal gain. Many trials and tribulations happen with the clinic. Operated for a couple of years, shut down for a while. We reopened it again because we knew that if we were ever going to make it work, it had to be operating. It ultimately was operating right out of the union hall, out of the health and safety offices. We parceled off part of our office there, so there's a private room. Chuck Emerson, who was the secretary of the Health and Safety Committee, Dr. Ciccione, who did the first study on cancer rates in Hamilton. He was a family physician. And the closer you were to Stelco Dofasco, the higher the cancer rates. And of course, because he was just a family physician, all the experts pissed all over his idea, quite frankly. But he was true on that. Those two people kept that flame going while the Labor Council now set up a steering committee. Peter Douglas from CUPE was president of the Labor Council at the time. He got $2,000 from the Oath of El to write the original proposal. Joanne Creccioli wrote the original proposal. It went to the Ministry of Health. It sat there for a year. We didn't hear anything back. I talked to Leo, and Leo says, well, where's the proposal? I was the only guy that kept all that paperwork. I says, oh, here's my copy of it. He says, rewrite it, give it to him. Inflate the figures a little. So it went from the original proposal up to the million that Leo talked about, and the people that in positions of power took that proposal and went and ran with it to get the money for the clinics. The clinics have, and the clinics, the idea of the clinics was to give us the resources that we need to take the companies on. And I don't know how many industrial hygiene reports I brought down to John Odike, who happens to be the longest serving employee. I just asked him, is he going to get a 30-year pin when his 30 years is getting close, I think.
Oh, passed already.
Has it passed already? Okay. To say, tell me what the industrial hygiene report's all about. Brought, I don't know how many autopsy reports. I brought of workplace fatalities down to the doctors. Tell me in plain language what this means. What killed this person? How did it happen? And interpret it for us. And that was the purpose ultimately in clinics. And as Alec has pointed out, we need more clinics in Ontario because the need is right across Ontario for clinics of this type that provide the expertise to workers to take the employers on. It was interesting that some of the biggest supporters of the concept of clinics in Hamilton were management people. Bob Milburn from Stelco, he was the works manager. And his nickname was Chainsaw Bob. That's what they called him, the workers, because he's always cutting jobs and that. But he was one, and of course we always put the management people in as the treasurer, so if anything went wrong with the books, they went to jail, not a worker. You know, remember that. There was a high-profile guy from Westinghouse, Campgold, that was on the board. We had Dr. Muir from McMaster University, Dr. Kirby from the Health Council. And that. So we were able to generate widespread support right across Hamilton. The Hamilton Academy of Medicine backed it up, our proposal. The Hamilton Wentworth District Health Council, that's how far back I go before Lynn's, supported the proposal. So we had a lot of support, not only from the labor movement, but across from other sectors in Hamilton that recognized the need for clinics. If it wasn't for a lot of good people that put in a lot of their own time, that believed in the concept and saw the value of it, we wouldn't have clinics as we have them today, funded by the government. And that was the key, because we ultimately realized that one local union or even the labor movement in Hamilton could not properly fund the clinics to keep them going in the form that we need. So that's sort of the short history of how we got to where we are now, 30 years later. 39 years ago, the first clinic opened up. It was past that, but here we are 30 years later for the Hamilton Clinic. And like in Hamilton, there's competition. I'll tell you this story. Competition between the Hamilton Clinic and the Toronto Clinic, which was going to open first. And we said, Hamilton Clinic, that's where the first clinic is. We're going to open first. It was on a Friday afternoon when we had the party. Okay, so all the people that showed up didn't have to go to work the next day. The Toronto clinic opened a week later on a Tuesday morning, and the turnout, you could count on two hands the turnout for the opening of the Toronto clinic. But we had a good party here in Hamilton when we opened the clinic up. And the other thing is, thank God Leo's not here. There's food for everybody else.
So I think part of what I was supposed to do is give you a sense of where knowledge activism came from. And so Don has always been one of the best examples I can produce. It was about the hunger that workers had to know how to fix stuff. That's where it came from. And what's interesting in the studies of what was coined by Alan Hall, who was the first academic to sort of join us in trying to study this, what was called knowledge activism was this. It wasn't just a political act. It is a political act, right? I mean, the reason why this is conflictual because it is built into our economic system. It's not about just about bad and good employers. If it was about that, we could have solved this problem quite easily, quite a long time ago. But it's much more than that. It's central to our economic system, that there are problems in health and safety because what we experience as health and safety issues, employers experience as costs. And it's the question of costs and reducing costs, which is always the primary question, and which is why the elimination of jobs becomes such a contentious issue. So it's really central we understand this. It is, I think, the contribution of what Eric would call the second wave of health and safety, the wave that came through in the 60s and 70s, is there was a hunger by the workers to actually participate. Some of my earliest functions as a steel worker were to go to events, usually populated with doctors and professors, and argue with them over what knowledge meant and what the perspective on what was happening meant. And try to change their view from a top-down, sort of controlling view to one that understood the conditions in the workers. And my favorite example was to go back in time, actually, to one that has come back with a vengeance, and that is to compare two of Ontario's greatest physicians and their responses to the silicosis crisis in mining in the 1920s and 30s, right? One of them, Norman Bethune, was called by the miners' unions in Northern Ontario to give advice, and he said it's the conditions under which these miners are forced to work. The other, Banting of Banting and Best, said, if you take a finely granulated aluminum powder and you require the worker to inhale it deeply into their lungs, it will protect them from exposure to silica and prevent silicosis. You know what I'm describing. The aluminum dust became known by the company that hired Banting to produce the report, which was the McIntyre Company, which was the big gold mining company in Northern Ontario. Banting did a lot of really good things. He did some other occupational stuff that was very good as well, but he tended to look at it from the employer's perspective. There was nothing wrong with the work. There was a problem with workers. They're weak, they're immigrants, they're people of color. There are all sorts of those kinds of excuses used as to why this wasn't a real problem that could be solved. That got fundamentally changed in the 1970s in Ontario when workers obtained through their struggle the right to participate, the right to have a voice, the right to refuse. And that was what led to this outreach. I mean, Leo could have talked about some of the other things that were done in Sudbury. The Local 6500 signed a collective agreement in 1973 that required the employer to invest $160,000, well, at that time actually it was a little less than that, it was about $180,000, I think, per annum in an ongoing study of cancer and cancer rates in the Inco's company, which at that point would have been both Sudbury and down the road at Port Colborne. And that's the creation of the Occupational Environmental Health Department at McMaster University. That's why Muir became head of that department and why they created the lab. It is the struggle of workers through their unions to get more knowledge for themselves. That is knowledge activism and what needs to be promoted. And I agree, Val, I've actually been talking to groups of management and others about this concept. Is a broader one because it is a movement. And health and safety movement means, therefore, it has to be a broad base. But you can't forget whose knowledge it is fundamentally we need in order for the activism to take place. And I think that's the key part of this. So, and what's the contribution of the 80s? So I'm going to give you my few thoughts as to the key things. And it's a message that some of you have heard because I don't really say much else besides this. There are many hazards still remaining. There is, however, no question whatsoever what the major issue is facing workers today, which is violence produced by psychosocial hazards. And that therefore we know what we can do with some of the others, but we're still struggling through this. And I think that what this teaches us, as occupational disease taught us, is at this point, with all the changes that have taken place in the workplace, unionization rates and all the rest, we're only going to make a difference if the tool that provides that is in the hands of every single worker. And that those workers can participate in themselves. And it's interesting, whenever I raise this, I often get people's hackles up and say, oh, you're talking about behavioral-based safety. You're saying the responsibility is all on the workers. Well, no, I'm not saying that it's the fault of the workers, but I am saying it is the responsibility of workers, just like it has been said before. You can't delegate your health and safety to another person. You have to be prepared to stand by those who represent you and support you, which is why you can always tell the best health and safety reps, because they, as our research showed, organize their members. They don't just sort of take the problem from them and take it over to do it. They actually organize them and get them to play a role. So put the tool in the hands of the workers and help to continue to understand and building the movement. And so when we reach out, let's just make sure at the same time we continue an orientation that understands that the fundamental purpose is to improve the conditions under which workers work. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Andy. Does anybody have any questions? And thanks, Don. That was very helpful to hear on the ground what it took, and the fact that it wasn't all smooth sailing, right? It's a learning process, and we continue to learn and evolve as our funding world changes, as the concerns in the media change, and yes, we are dealing with legacy issues like the McIntyre powder with our McIntyre powder project in Sudbury.